As you've probably noticed by now, there are a few differences during Advent. The color of the vestment, so the responses are a little bit different. We're here to take us out of our normal routine because we are beginning the liturgical year. And as we know, the season of Advent has a twofold character. The first part, the first aspect of Advent is that we are preparing for the celebration of Christmas, the first coming of the Son of God. But as we know, likewise, Advent is a time of looking forward to the future, to the second and definitive coming of Jesus Christ at the end of time, when, as we profess in the Creed, he will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead. That's why the first Advent of all three of the cycles, first, is this here, the A, B, and C cycle, exhorts us to be watchful, to be vigilant. This is what Jesus says in the Gospel. Be watchful, be alert. And it is certainly in regards to the second coming of Jesus Christ that Jesus tells us to be alert. Watch, he says. Jesus warns us that he may come suddenly, and the worst thing that could happen would be for him to find us asleep. This would be the greatest tragedy for the believer, that when Christ comes, or that when he stands before God, the moment before he stands before God, he was caught asleep. What does it mean to be asleep? Well, it can signify two things according to the scriptures. One is to be in a state of what we would call spiritual torpor. In other words, a state of mental and spiritual inactivity, to be lethargic, to be passive, to really be doing nothing in our spiritual lives, just simply existing, kind of like a plant, being vegetative. That's one meaning of what it means to be asleep. But St. Paul also reminds us that we can also be asleep when we are so overwhelmed by the things of this world, we are so given in to the things of this world, we are so self-indulgent that we simply don't have time to dedicate to the things of God. In other words, to be watchful means that we are not consumed with the things of this world. We are not simply allowing time to pass by, to be lethargic or passive. To be watchful, St. Paul tells us, is to be alive, awake, sober in the faith. And so in practical terms, what does it mean to be alive in the faith as opposed to being asleep in the faith? Well, again, we go to St. Paul in his first letter to the Thessalonians, to the Christians of Thessalonica. He says to them, "Do not be asleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. Since we belong to the day, let us be sober," in other words, be watchful, "and let us put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet, the hope of salvation." And again, we see what St. Paul is speaking about. Being sober is the opposite of being self-indulgent. If someone, for example, is under the influence of marijuana, whether it's medicinal, recreational, or any type of marijuana, I don't know how they term it nowadays, someone is certainly not sober. Well, the same thing when someone is under the influence of the world. They're intoxicated. They are consumed with the world, and therefore they are not sober, says St. Paul. And therefore, to be sober, we must be watchful. He says in order to be sober, we should be continually putting on the breastplate of faith and love and the helmet of hope. In other words, this spiritual armor. This is what it means to be watchful. This is what it means to be alive in faith. And as we can see, it's not something passive. It's not simply waiting around. Being watchful is an active disposition of the soul, where we are continually looking to grow in the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. That's why, brothers and sisters, in our spiritual lives, if we don't have a fervent prayer life, if we're not growing in faith and knowledge of Jesus Christ, then we are asleep. And this is a very dangerous state to be in. And that's why St. Paul in today's beautiful second reading, this is the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians, says something that I think is very worthy of our consideration. He says we should give thanks to God for the grace that he has bestowed on us in Jesus Christ. He says that in him, God,
we have been enriched in every way. He says we are not lacking in any spiritual gift. And if we remain in him, in Jesus, the Lord will keep us firm to the end. So again, we see that being watchful is a remaining, it is a growing in our knowledge and love of Jesus Christ. And that's why at the end of today's reading, this second reading, St. Paul will say that our life here and now is a call to fellowship with Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Let that thought sink in for a second. Our life here is a call to live an active fellowship, an active relationship, an active union with the very Son of God himself. And that is why, as Catholics, we truly have a great grace. As St. Paul says, we are enriched in every way. We are not lacking any spiritual gift. Because through the Church, God has given us every spiritual gift necessary in order for this relationship with Jesus, for this fellowship to grow and to blossom. And again, let us never forget, these realities are objective. It doesn't matter how I feel. When I go to confession and I confess my sins, and if I truly confess all the sins, the mortal sins that I'm aware of, if I am contrite, whether I feel I've been forgiven or not, it does not matter. You have been forgiven. When you come up to receive the Eucharist, whether you feel it or not, it really is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. And this is the great beauty of our Catholic faith. These are objective realities. The sacraments, the words, the teachings of Jesus, the life of grace that is within us. When we are filled with God and his grace, we have the indwelling of the Holy Trinity within us. We Catholics are what people would call today, and I hate to use this word, actually I like to use it because it's a very controversial word. We Catholics are privileged. Privileged. But we're really privileged. No false privilege here. It's a real privilege. Because we have this fullness of God's richness, the spiritual gifts. That is why as Catholics, we have as St. Paul says, every spiritual gift, every way to be enriched into form of fellowship. And let us never forget, therefore, brothers and sisters, this is why as Catholics, as we begin this Advent season, we have a hope that is real. We have a hope that is based on reality. We look at the first coming of Jesus, Jesus who came to this earth, Jesus who suffered and died for our sins, and Jesus Christ who was crucified and rose from the dead. Jesus has triumphed. This is not a pious thought. This is a reality. It's just as real as the air we breathe. In fact, I would say more so, because the air we breathe comes from the very one who became man, suffered and died, and rose from the dead. Jesus the Lord. And this is why we have the hope that we do. Our hope is a real hope. As I said, it is not based on emotions or pious desires, but upon the reality of Jesus Christ. And Jesus was not simply a historical figure. Jesus is the Lord who died for our sins and rose from the dead. What therefore to think of Christians who despair, who seem not to have hope? It would be difficult to think that those Christians really believe in Jesus, that they really understand or comprehend the certainty of his victory, of his resurrection. Despair never comes from Christ. Despair is always a sign that we are lacking in hope. A hope that, as I said, is a real hope, an objective hope. And therefore, brothers and sisters, if we truly desire to triumph with Jesus because he has already triumphed, St. Paul says we must persevere with him. We must watch and be alert. This is what Christ says in today's gospel. We must remain in him. We must watch. We must grow in our fellowship with Jesus the Lord. In today's first reading, the prophet Isaiah calls God our Father and our Redeemer, and he has a very beautiful phrase at the very end. of today's first reading. He says that we are the clay, God is the potter. We are the work of his hands. In other words, fellowship with God, fellowship with Christ, allows us to be formed and to grow in the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. If we allow God into our lives, if we allow him to form us as a potter forms the clay, we will become truly beautiful creations. We will become Christians filled with the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And the greater our union with God, the greater our fellowship with Christ, the stronger our faith will be, the more resilient our hope, despite all of the reasons to despair or to be anxious. If we are truly filled with these theological virtues, we will have a resilient hope that will never, ever be overcome. And our love will grow more perfect every day. And that is why at the beginning of this Advent, let us remember that it is a time to renew and to deepen the hope that we have. And perhaps for some Catholics, unfortunately, it's a time to rediscover the hope they should have had and should always have. Those of us who possess this faith in Jesus Christ, this knowledge of what he has done in his first coming, should never, ever be anxious about the future, because Jesus has triumphed, and he invites us to fellowship with him, to triumph with him. Pope Emeritus Benedict, in his encyclical Spe Salvi, In Hope We Are Saved, and I would recommend if anyone is looking for some good spiritual reading during Advent, his encyclical is a very short encyclical. It's something you can get online through the internet. He says something that I think is so worthy of our consideration today. He says, "In hope we were saved," quoting St. Paul in his letter to the Romans. According to the Christian faith, says the Pope, redemption, salvation, is not simply a given. Redemption is offered to us in the sense that we have been given hope, a trustworthy hope. This, brothers and sisters, is so important because the hope we have in Jesus Christ, again, let me underscore it. It is not just a pious emotion. It is fact. It is objective reality. Jesus has come. He has died on the cross. He rose from the dead. He has redeemed us. And he calls us to fellowship with him. And that's why the Pope will say that our hope is a trustworthy hope, by virtue of which we can face our present. In other words, no matter what we have before us, no matter what situation we may be in now, we can face it because we have the hope that's objectively in Jesus Christ. And that's why he will continue. He says, here we see the distinguishing mark of Christians, the fact that we have a future. When St. Paul writes to the Ephesians, he says, before their encounter with Christ, you were without hope. You were without God in this world. What was St. Paul saying? St. Paul was basically telling the Ephesians that they had their gods, they had their religion, but nothing gives the hope of the Christian faith. Only the Christian faith. More than science, more than success, more than anything else. Brothers and sisters, the greatest tragedy is when a Christian loses their hope in Jesus Christ and begins to place their hope in something that passes away. Science. We know so much now. We're so enlightened. And yet look at what's happening during this COVID epidemic. Science still knows so little. And it's not solved the problem of death because it never will solve the problem of death. All of us will die. But we have the hope that death is not the end. Why? Because Jesus in his first coming has died for our sins and risen from the dead. And he invites us to fellowship with him. That's why the Holy Father will say that this distinguishing mark of the Christian is that we indeed have a future. And only when this future is certain, as it is for us, because we know Jesus is truly not just a historical figure, he is the Lord and risen, that we can see everything as a positive reality. It will become possible, says the Holy Father, to live the present moment in hope because we see what Jesus has done in the past. And that's why the gospel is not merely a communication of things to be known. This is very important. The Holy Father tells us that the gospel or Christianity is not just about certain facts. It's not just about things that we know about God. No. He says The gospel makes things happen. It is life-changing. And the one who has hope lives differently. The one who hopes has been granted the gift of a new life. Anyone who truly believes and places their hope in Jesus Christ understands that this is indeed a new life. Brothers and sisters, if we look at the world today, there are many reasons to be afraid. There are many reasons to be anxious. But this is if we see things from simply a worldly point of view. Will our country be engulfed in socialism? Will I contract COVID and die? Will I lose my job? Well, these are real fears. I'm not in any way trying to downplay these fears. But as we begin Advent, our gaze should be directed not to our fears, not to the anxieties, but again, as the Lord tells us, to his first coming, when he was victorious over sin and death. That's why at Advent we also look at this first coming of Jesus to see what he accomplished. And for those of us who grasp this reality in faith, and again, our faith is not a blind reality, it is absolutely built upon objective truth, ultimate truth. Jesus is God and Lord. And for those who authentically place their hope in Jesus Christ, yes, there are reasons to be afraid. There are reasons to be anxious. But if our hope in Jesus is real, then there are infinitely more reasons to be filled with hope, no matter what happens in our world. There are infinitely more reasons to see things in a new light. And that is why, brothers and sisters, during this first Sunday of Advent, let us truly understand that Jesus, who has come, will come again. And this life is about forming a fellowship, a union with him. This is what it means to be watchful, to be alert, not to be passive, not to be consumed or intoxicated with the things of this world, but to truly place our hope firmly on the only thing worthy of the Christian's hope, Jesus Christ, the Lord.